Hello and welcome to the February 12th edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I am Anthony Bardaway. Now, before we begin, I would like to make an announcement about Romeo and I's other job, which is at the New Voice of Ukraine, one of the larger media outlets within Ukraine. It has quite a solid history going back in its Ukrainian language content, and for the last 3 years with English language content as well. Well, 3+ years. Sorry, it's been going on a bit longer before the full scale, but that's kind of where I've been at. Over at New Voice of Ukraine, we are expanding upon our video and premium content. So check out English.nvua for the website itself. And then we're expanding more on YouTube, TikTok, Blue Sky, all the social medias besides Instagram. That's kind of being put on hold for the moment. It's a big undertaking on its own. So if you want more good, solid daily coverage of the goings on in Ukraine, please go to the New Voice of Ukraine. Recently, I did an interview on the effects of the American foreign aid freeze. We're not going to talk about that this episode. I'll go into it more in a second. But for the purposes of Ukraine Without Hype, I will say that I think I'll be pushing most of the interviews over to the New Voice of Ukraine because I need to fill out interview time. Unless it is something a bit more niche or weird, then we can have it on Ukraine Without Hype. But booking interviews is a difficult process. And keep in mind, if you're supporting Ukraine Without Hype, you're also supporting New Voice of Ukraine in that way. So more content, still me, still Romeo, just slightly different outlet. And of course, if you would like to support Ukraine Without Hype, you can always go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype and support us directly there. And with that announcement out of the way, moving on to the episode. And for this episode, I know that what most of you want to hear about right now is the various going-ons in the United States. And trust me, we'll get to it next week, though, because we have not had a proper news episode for the last few episodes. We had our history episode and our 100th New Year episode, so there has been some interruptions in the regularly scheduled news roundups that we really need to get to because quite a lot has happened in the last, month and a half since we last talked about it. So stay with me because we are not talking about Donald Trump in this episode. We're talking about everything else. So now for everything not Trump. And the first part of that is, of course, the battlefield updates. We have not checked in on that in a while, and we have to get back to it. So we're just going to go north to south on this one, and we'll start at the northernmost part of this, which is the Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk Oblast, which has passed its 6-month anniversary. Now, since that initial extremely rapid gain in territory within that first week or so 6 months ago, the Russians have slowly taken control over much of the formerly occupied Kursk Oblast. There has been a lot of back and forth, a lot of shifting around, but in the grand scale, Ukraine controls significantly less than they did 6 months ago. However, within these last few days, or last week really, there was a localized counteroffensive immediately east of the city of Sudzha in order to shore up some of the defensive depth they may have there. The Russians were pushing pretty close into the surrounding villages of Sudzha, and that was turning out to be a very serious problem. So to solve it, there was a buildup and a localized counteroffensive that was able to push a few kilometers back into the Russian-held territory and create a larger buffer zone around Sudzha. The other news coming out of this is that it seems to be unclear what the North Koreans are doing there at the moment. The North Korean soldiers were providing a lot of the offensive heft behind the Kursk counteroffensives there, and there has been some going back and forth as to the state of those North Korean soldiers. There was some news that perhaps they were being pulled away, that was contradicted by other reports, but with everything else coming out of Kursk Oblast, it's hard to really say for certain what is going on there. We do have it pretty much confirmed that the North Korean soldiers that were sent to Kursk were these special forces, which was my guess at the beginning. I said that I didn't think that North Korea would send too many soldiers so far away unless their loyalty could be secured, and Special Forces fits that description pretty well. And it also matches up some of the reports that the North Koreans in this sector were fighting better than the Russians. The Russians, a lot of them would have been conscripts, whereas the North Koreans' Special Forces, it again makes sense that the North Koreans would be fighting a bit better. But what they're doing now, it seems very, very uncertain. No, air raid alarm, but they're pretty common, so just moving on. Doubt you could even hear it over the microphone. So then turning south, sorry, I'm leaving this in. I'm leaving my hesitations in. Keep it in. Keep rolling. So moving south through Volchansk, there's been very little changes there, so I'll just kind of roll over that to the Kupiansk front. In Kupiansk, to the east of Kharkiv, the last time we spoke about the updates to the situation there, I was mentioning how the Russians had enclosed Kupiansk to both the northern and southern sides and had broken through the Ukrainian lines to the west of Sinkivka, which had been the front line for many months since Ukraine was able to do its Kharkiv counteroffensives so long ago at this point. And I mentioned that I thought that would be the area that would see the most deterioration because it is on the other side of that river. However, looking at it now is certainly dangerous, very, very dangerous. But the rapidity of the Russian advance there since we last spoke about it has significantly declined. And actually, there has been very little change in that front since then. So whatever severe danger that Kupiansk was put in at the time, it still is in severe danger, but the Ukrainian armed forces were able to stop some of the bleeding in that direction, with one exception, which is that the Russians were able to cross the Oskol River to the north of Kupiansk and have been able to make slow gains to the other side of the Oskol since then. Now, the Oskol in this direction is not very large. A crossing was not terribly difficult, but the Russians had always been less than spectacular at river crossings, as we've seen time and time again, and even did a bit of an episode about that specifically. But a lot of the defenses in this area are based around the use of the Oskol River, and the penetration beyond it is definitely a problem for those defenses. Significantly south of there, of course, is Chasiv Yar, and we have not covered Chasiv Yar too specifically because as the Russians have been making advances there, they were very, very slow. The battle for Chasiv Yar has lasted an extremely long time. But at this point, the Russians control most of the town of Chasiv Yar, whatever, of course, is left standing of it, which is almost nothing. Chasiv Yar was the fortress town that was protecting Kostyantynivka further to the west, and due to its topographical features, being at slightly larger height than most of the surrounding steppe, this has been such an important fortress in protecting this last big urban city conglomeration of Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, Kostyantynivka that we've always been talking about. If Chasiv Yar falls completely, that will be a serious blow. There's still several lines of defense between it and Kostyantynivka. It is still very much a grind if Russia intends to push through it, but we are drawing closer to that battle. Next, down to the New York Toretsk area, we had discussed the fall of the city of New York, and Toretsk is just about there as well. The battle for Toretsk has been a long and bloody one here. And the lines of control in that city are confusing, to say the least. There's a road here, a road there that the Russians control, lots of urban fighting, house to house, basement to basement is what this is really about. The Russians are controlling more and more of the town to the point where it's the parts that they don't control are gray zone. And no one's calling it the city as being fully under Russian control yet, but that's happening, and it will be yet another blow to the defenses of the remainder of Donbass. And of course, from there to Pokrovsk, this has been a difficult one, because as we've talked about, the actual defenses of Pokrovsk itself, the Russians have not been able to break through, and because of that, they've been trying to attack further west to cut Pokrovsk off from supply, to put it into a kettle, and surround the defenders there. And so far, that has been the direction that's been going in. But especially within these last few days, Ukraine has launched these localized counteroffensives that have been able to dislodge the Russians from some of these forward positions that they've been having. And I'm always very weary of these reports of, oh, the Russians are slowing down, but there have been reports of the Russians facing serious setbacks in the Pokrovsk direction. And just as a symbolic thing, this Russian push westward from Pokrovsk has been threatening the entrance marker to the Donetsk Oblast. That if you follow Ukraine, if you follow Ukrainian journalists, volunteers, a lot of them will make the stopover at this stele, this statue for representing the entrance to Donetsk Oblast. It has a lot of emotive value to a lot of people here. It is the entrance to the war. It's where people meet up to move forward. And the Russian advance has put this entrance statue under greater and greater threat to the point where it's now covered up in an anti-drone netting, so it can't be destroyed so easily. But the battle for Pokrovsk, which for the last few months has, quite frankly, only been a series of extraordinarily frustrating setbacks, has shown some reversals within this last week. However, everything to the south of Pokrovsk has seen more Russian advances. Of course, the fall of Velkia Novosilka was a serious loss, and the Russians are currently in the process of capturing the town of Andriivka. And there are still this problem that we've talked about before of Ukrainians being left too deep within these Russian pockets and being forced to make much more chaotic withdrawals, more costly withdrawals than they could have. And the last thing to talk about as far as combat actions going on, near the start of the new year, there was a very curious Russian action happening across the Dnipro River. Apparently, somebody in the Russian military thought that they could do a buildup to force a crossing of the Dnipro River into the western bank that is held by Ukraine. And the fact that you didn't hear about this anywhere else, despite the fact that it's been several weeks now, is that, of course, it was a miserable failure. And since then, not many people have talked about it. There was a lot of discussion of the build-up to this crossing and when this crossing, they made a go of it. And I just don't understand it. And no one has been able to give me very adequate answers as to why they thought that could be a good idea, except maybe to draw forces away from Pokrovsk. That's the only explanation. But I think we can all agree that crossing the Dnipro River is not an easy thing to do, and doing it as a distraction in either way is not a good idea. But that concludes our combat updates. Interestingly, not as dire as the last time I was talking about it. A lot of the paranoia that I was having about rapid collapses in multiple directions, that has slowed down in most of them, though the Russians are still making advances. Southern Donetsk Oblast, it's very, very ugly down there, and they are pushing ever closer to the boundary between Donetsk Oblast and Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, and crossing into a new region which thus far has not seen direct fighting. It's something very much to worry about. But moving on to the other form of combat, which is in the air. The Russians have, of course, been continuing their air campaign. It never slows down, but we have not talked about it, so here we are. And the most dramatic I can say, though it was not as deadly as some of the others, was a strike on downtown Odesa on January 31st, which was a weekend. And these strikes on downtown Odesa hit some extremely famous landmarks. It caused some damage outside of the Odesa Opera House, perhaps the most iconic building in the entire city. But one of the more direct hits was the Bristol Hotel. The Bristol Hotel, I mean, what building in downtown Odesa is not a landmark? It's all landmarks. It's all beautiful. If you can go to Odessa, do so, even as I'm talking about people being murdered there. But the Bristol Hotel, famous for these statues staying out front of it. It's a very nice hotel, very upmarket. The Norwegian diplomats were there at the time, but it went through the roof, crashed into the lobby, injuring at least 7 people. This was right across from the house that Pushkin, the Russian poet Pushkin, lived in and used to have a statue of him out front of. So, with all this talk of how dare Ukraine tear down the symbols of Russian culture in Ukraine, the Russians themselves decided to just drop a missile on top of one of those remnants of Russian culture in Ukraine. So, I don't know, maybe focus more on that. I'm a bit bitter about this one article in The Economist that they keep on reposting because they know it gets rage clicks anyway. Also injuring and many people and damaging other landmarks in its vicinity, including the Jewish University of Odesa. Other much more deadly strikes happened on the cities of Zaporizhia and Sumy, Kryvyi Rih, several others, though Zaporizhia was especially egregious because the same territory was hit multiple times over the course of a few days. In the other direction, though, of instead of missiles and drones going from Russia to Ukraine, we have to talk about this missile and drone offensive that Ukraine is launching on Russian oil refineries specifically, and other installations too. But oil refineries have been the main focus of this particular campaign, to the point where of the largest oil refineries in Russia, most of them have been hit by now. Not all of them destroyed, of course. Only so much damage can be done with any one of these missiles or drones, but causing damage of some level or another as far away as Kazan. The direct economic impact that these strikes are having are, of course, a Russian state secret. It's hard to get good estimations of how much damage economically is done to Russia because of this. But they are a fossil fuel exporter. Hitting them in their wallet is one of the best strategies that Ukraine can continue with going forward. And it has really shown no sign of slowing down. We will continue to see these strikes on Russian infrastructure, particularly economic infrastructure, because these drones and missiles being used in this campaign are homemade. They are coming from Ukraine, from Ukrainian manufacturers, on Ukrainian designs, using Ukrainian controllers. So this problem of America and the Europeans telling Ukraine that they cannot use long-range weapons against targets within Russia itself, that's now irrelevant because Ukraine is making its own and being very effective at it. Now, they do not have the industrial capacity that, say, a Germany or a France or a United States has to produce these missiles, so it is not the quantity that could be done if given as much support from our allies, though a lot of the restrictions on that are lifted or reduced compared to how they used to be. But this self-reliance idea is going to be an important one going forward, and not for reasons we're going to talk about this episode, but next episode. Not in the Trump episode. Though we talked about all this during episode 100, we're talking about, the benefits that Ukraine has going forward into 2025. I said this is the most important one, and I'm still very confident in what I said there. And this part is done during editing right before release, but just last night there was another very large attack on Kyiv. It killed one, injured others, but also what stands out from it is that one of the locations that was struck was Romeo and I's former employer, UATV. The team there was apparently not there at the time yet. This is about 4:30 in the morning, so there were no casualties among them. But there we go. I guess the third front I can say in the combat between Russia and Ukraine is the War of Assassins. On Ukraine's side, there's been a lot of assassinations on Russian and pro-Russian targets, but this latest one was Armen Sargsyan. He was the head of the boxing federation in Donetsk, occupied Donetsk. He was a collaborator with the Russians and had helped to form military units to use against Ukraine, who's the official leader of the Arbat battalion. And to make this completely clear, he was a mafia boss. He was just a head of the local mafia, and someday I would like to do a deeper dive onto what exactly the Donetsk People's Republic was and perhaps is, and really it's just a series of criminal networks tied together by Russian intelligence services, and he was one of these mob bosses that they strung together. But he was in Moscow. when he was blown up by a bomb of some kind in the lobby of the building that he was in. Several other people were injured, including one of his bodyguards, and he did not die immediately on the spot, but did later succumb to his wounds. Ukraine has not taken credit for this, but good job whoever did it. And in the other direction, we have news of an assassination attempt, and that is Russia apparently was trying to kill the CEO of the German company Rheinmetall, Armin Paperger. Rheinmetall, the massive German corporation, as you can tell from the name, that's some heavy industry, had been doing a lot to arm Ukraine. They had even opened up several factories within Ukraine so Ukrainian workers could produce the weapons being used by the Ukrainian military. And really, this localization, which I talked about in regards to locally made missiles, has been such an important thing because it not only means that Ukraine is not entirely reliant on aid for its ammunition and weaponry, but also that's an economy. We need to keep the Ukrainian economy going, and those Rheinmetall factories are part of the Ukrainian GDP. So wonderful. Which of course very much angered the Russians, and they attempted to kill the CEO, but their plan was foiled before it could be carried out. It was announced that this plot was discovered, but the Russians were not able to act upon it. So that's all the war-specific news that you missed since December. Had to do some catching up there. But now we also have to talk about some scandals that were occurring in Ukraine. Now, during the 100th episode, Romeo already discussed this, but there was the arrest of some of the senior officers involved in the defense of Kharkiv Oblast. Their malfeasance in that case, or alleged malfeasance, that is, of course, still being investigated and tried, could have led to partially the success of the Russian offensive into Kharkiv Oblast last year. And that's now being taken extremely seriously, but we had already spoken about that last episode. There's also a problem of the chief army psychiatrist was arrested on corruption charges, and overall there has been a string of anti-corruption arrests within this last month, though most of them not so serious. So there does appear to be a bit of a crackdown, some corruption, other problems within the military going on at the moment. But speaking of problems in the military that have been addressed, and we do have to talk about the 155th Mechanized Brigade, also known as Anne of Kiev. Anne of Kiev, if you listen to our history episode, she was a medieval Ukrainian princess who became the Queen of France. So that's most things that involve a connection between Ukraine and France refer to Anne of Kiev. And this unit had been trained in France. It had been outfitted with some more advanced weaponry. But the scandal this year, so the 155th Mechanized Brigade, Anne of Kiev, was reported as facing a lot of desertions, unusual numbers of soldiers that had gone AWOL, and that the leadership of that brigade had failed to prevent that from happening and had also done many leadership failures that would lead to such a high attrition rate, to the point where now the former brigade commander is arrested and being detained under charges of inaction, not telling higher ups that these problems were occurring, and potentially being the cause of a lot of these problems. They had taken pretty abnormally high casualties, which was another reason why these desertions had taken place. And this story ended up with a lot of the soldiers and equipment being reassigned to other units. Some Ukrainian media had reported that the unit was then therefore disbanded. This was not the case. It has been formally restored as of a few days ago, though smaller units within it had been utilized since then. And the brigade is now taking part in the defense of Krovsk. This is all a catastrophe that underlines a lot of the problems that most observers have been talking about quite a while. Some of the failures of the officer corps, some of the issues of just making a new unit instead of reinforcing old ones. That's one thing that we talked about in the 100th episode. But because of having such a big headline story and a thing to specifically point to, we are starting to see some changes for the better to address these issues. The first of these is that President Zelensky announced that no new brigades would be formed, though that's not a hard and fast rule, of course. But instead of forming these new brigades and putting a bunch of fresh soldiers in there with new equipment and suboptimal officers a lot of the time, they would instead be backfilling already existing units that had suffered casualties and other reductions in their personnel that had to be bolstered. So instead of allowing these older brigades to just get fewer and fewer in number until they go away, to instead actually reinforce them, which is such an important thing because new soldiers need to be integrated with more experienced soldiers so they can learn. When there's an attack or a defense, you don't want everyone holding a position to have it be their first day on the job. Maybe one guy is having his first day. He can be told what to do by the people around him. This is one of the big benefits that the Ukrainian army had right at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, where a lot of veteran soldiers were dispersed pretty well within these newly formed units, especially within the territorial defense, so that new guys could learn from veterans. That is how a military has to operate, and Ukraine finally came to this realization once again. And this other issue of manpower, we've been talking a lot about how there has been a problem with you can't conscript all the young people because Ukraine doesn't have enough young people. And there just isn't that big supply of them to go around at the moment. But the government did realize that at the same time, most militaries are made up of young men. Your average US infantryman is 20 years younger than the average Ukrainian infantryman. That's a problem. That might be an exaggeration. And there are reasons for that. Young men are in better shape and make good soldiers. So there was an announcement by the Ukrainian government that young Ukrainian men between the ages of 18 and 24 are not being mobilized. However, they are being offered extra benefits for signing a contract to volunteer to join the military. These are going to be extra monetary benefits, of course, but apparently it will only last for 1 year. This will be a 1-year contract. And that is the biggest impediment to a lot of Ukrainian recruitment right now. If you join the military, there is no end in sight for you. You're in it until Ukraine wins. And that can be any time. That could be years. The issue of demobilization, of moving soldiers out of the military, or in many ways just to allow people to rest before they can do something else, has been such a continuous problem. So offering people the opportunity to say you're in for 1 year is all you're obliged to do. That's big. That's real big. I think a lot of people will agree to take this because there's a lot of people out there who would be glad to join the military if they knew that they had some control over that and it wasn't just indefinite service. But speaking of mobilization, to our other scandal is that recently there have been a series of attacks on Ukrainian mobilization offices. February 1st in Rivne, someone took a bomb to the mobilization office, though they only managed to blow up themselves. February 5th, same thing in Kamyansk-Podilsky. And on January 31st, there's a shooting in Poltava. Now, you may think that there could be, some frustration with the mobilization officers, but that does not actually seem to be the case. Instead, what's happening right now is that Russia is targeting vulnerable people to carry out attacks on their behalf. These happen in Telegram channels where often people who are quite poor, perhaps with some kind of substance abuse issue, are being offered a couple $1,000s in order to carry out these attacks. And these have all recently, because these have all happened within a couple days span of time, we can understand that this is part of a dedicated campaign by the Russian intelligence services that they are doing. And we're not so far away from any of these attacks, so it is quite possible that they are not yet done with them. I assume that the Russian intelligence services are thinking that they can make these attacks look like people who are just mad at mobilization to get some adrenaline pumped into the veins of some of the anti-mobilization movement in Ukraine, but they are never very subtle. Moving on to our next section. And this is a story from Christmas Day, actually. And this is a story of Azerbaijan Airlines Flight 8243. This airline was doing a pretty short commuter flight from Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, to Grozny, the capital of Chechnya. This is not a very long flight. It's a pretty short distance between them, but, mountainous, so I could see why some people would rather take the plane to a pretty rough drive. So they're taking this short commuter, just pond hopper, on the way from Baku to Grozny, but there was some fog that night, so they were left in a holding pattern around Grozny airport for a little bit. And during this time, they were hit by something. They had assumed that they had had a pretty catastrophic strike with a bird, but further investigation proved this very much was not the case. What actually happened was that they're hit by a Russian anti-aircraft missile that shredded a lot of the fuselage. Not long before this, there was a Ukrainian drone attack on Grozny, as these attacks on Grozny had become increasingly frequent. And the anti-aircraft soldiers there were on very high alert. And in their alertness, they shot down a passenger airliner. This is, of course, not the first time that Russian forces have done this. You can look at MH17 from that first summer of the Donbass War for another example. But after being hit, they were told not to land at Grozny Airport and were instead redirected across the Caspian Sea towards Kazakhstan. And it is after they had crossed the Caspian Sea that they crashed within Kazakhstan. Russia tried to cover this up. They initially denied all of this, but because they were directed over the sea, I think that a very solid theory for what happened was that they realized that they shot down a passenger airliner and were hoping that it would crash into the water and everyone would drown and no one would find out about this. However, the Azerbaijan government made quite a bit of a fuss. Their people were just murdered. And over the course of a few weeks since then, Russia gave kind of a non-apology, didn't really fess up to what happened, but tensions between Moscow and Baku have been pretty tense since then. Azerbaijan has been a close ally of Russia, and Russia just denying that they did this crime definitely put off a lot of people in Baku. Not so much to change anything politically, I don't believe, but all Azerbaijan media were definitely pointing the finger pretty strongly. And in a country like Azerbaijan, where the press pretty much does what it's told, we can understand that the vitriol coming from the press was with the endorsement of Aliyev. The most recent update to this was on February 4th. There was a report by the Kazakhstan Ministry of Transport, as that was the country that this crashed in once again, and they had discovered, quote, external objects in the structure, which were fragments from the Pantsir S-1 anti-aircraft missile that was fired at it. This is going to be an ongoing story of who can take blame, but I think considering the political reliance between Moscow and Azerbaijan, I will take a shot in the dark and assume that this will be peppered over with some kind of payment to Azerbaijan, either political or economic of some kind, in order to get them to be mollified a bit. But as always, the crime is always in the cover-up, and Russia definitely made everything worse for themselves. In the meantime, the Azerbaijani response is more in the form of diplomacy and symbolic actions. They have shut down the Russia House Cultural Center in Baku, the soft power diplomatic institution there. So tensions, though not anything too formal, really, at least yet. Now looking at some more news coming out of Ukraine's western neighbors. This has to do with the transport of Russian fossil fuels across Ukraine in pipelines through Ukrainian territory. Now, this may surprise some people, but yes, Russia continued to use its pipelines that went across Ukraine. We've pointed this out before, but it is pretty weird how during this whole war, Russia was still using Ukrainian infrastructure for its economic activities. A lot of countries in Europe were still reliant on Russian energy, though over time, over the last 3 years, it has been less of a problem. More countries have found alternative sources, but not all countries. Unfortunately, Hungary is very mad because they were very reliant, though the problem that we're seeing the most from was from Slovakia. Robert Fico, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, failed to make any planning for what to do without Russian energy. And because of that, Slovakia was caught pretty flat-footed. They had been warned that with the incoming new year, Ukraine would no longer be transporting Russian fossil fuels across its territory. The contract to do that, which was pretty important because it has also tied them to Europeans, and you can't drop that immediate problem onto Europe's lap without giving them some time to adjust for it. But Slovakia had this deadline. They knew that with the beginning of 2025, they would no longer be receiving anything through these pipelines. They knew it. But Robert Fico decided that instead of doing anything to plan for the economic and personal well-being of his country, he would instead just complain a lot. So now he found himself with a bit of an energy crisis, and that he is blaming Ukraine for. And as this energy crisis was happening, he was also facing a row of other protests against his government for other related reasons, including his gross corruption. And many Slovaks did not appreciate it when Fico visited Moscow on December 26th. So throughout this year, so the end of December into January and now February, Slovakia has seen a lot of pro-democracy, pro-European, pro-Ukrainian, anti-corruption protests against the sitting government of Robert Fico. And they were just presented with another problem when a member of their governing coalition, the Voice Social Democracy Party, expelled 3 of its members over internal party issues that we do not have to get into because I don't fully know the ins and outs of Slovak politics anyway, but then became that because of that, the government lost its ruling majority. The Slovak government has a pretty large number of political parties, actually, and so losing a little bit from any one of them is a crisis. So that's what they're left with. So after losing this majority, Robert Fico is also facing a motion of no confidence, where his many failings as a national leader has led to people, the opposition, claiming that he is incompetent to further stand office. He has failed so hard they should have another election. That has not yet materialized, but people are still in the streets making that demand. So all these factors of kissing up to Russia, of corruption, all that, as always, are tied together. Meanwhile, Fico has blamed more and more of his problems on Ukraine, saying that the Ukrainians are trying to organize a revolution against him. That is the go-to excuse for every would-be Eastern European autocrat. If there is a problem, say that some outside force is trying to color revolution you. So they've claimed that Ukrainians are organizing a revolution. They have arrested people over this. They are blaming everything on Ukrainians. If there's a break of a water main, a Ukrainian did it. And now that they are dealing with all that, Fico is now claiming that he will shut off energy flows into Ukraine itself. Ukraine does purchase a lot of electricity from Slovakia, and he's saying that will no longer be the case, as well as pipelines for natural gas. But these protests are only getting bigger. There's only becoming a longer list of complaints. And as this is all happening, Fico himself, never a very clever or emotionally stable man, has become increasingly unhinged and paranoid. So best of luck to the protesters. Slovakia is not Russia. Slovakia is Europe. And the other country, though, that has been impacted by this shutdown of the Ukrainian transit pipelines is Moldova and its breakaway Russian-occupied region of Transnistria. Transnistria all this time has been entirely subsidized by Russia. We have talked about Transnistria a bunch of times in the past. This region of Moldova that has been occupied by the Russian military since the civil war in the early 90s and is currently a self-styled breakaway, non-recognized republic that is nonetheless in most ways completely economically integrated with the rest of Moldova. But Transnistria was completely reliant on the deliveries of Russian gas. And without that, they are now facing an extreme energy crisis. Slovakia is still connected to the rest of Europe. There is obvious solutions in place. Everyone else is able to find solutions. It's just a matter of Fico being incompetent and stubborn. But with Transnistria, Russia was the only game in town. They have been offered various lifelines from Europe and turned them down because they recognize that once Transnistria is no longer connected to Russian gas, but is instead connected to European energy, that's kind of a very short road from there to just Transnistria being reintegrated into the rest of Moldova. Their little criminal separatist project would have a time limit at that point, and they are trying to forestall that as much as possible despite the absolute crisis that they exist in. Though Moldova itself has been able to make some accommodations for them. That said, Moldova is also impacted by this. They were also importing a lot of Russian fossil fuel, and they are of course, connected to Transnistria. There's a power plant in Transnistria that supplies a lot of Moldova. That power plant, without fuel, is not much of a power plant, leading to shortages in Moldova. Though these shortages in Moldova proper are not as severe because they see no issue with being supported by Europe. Romania has stepped in to help. They're gonna figure it out. They are dealing with increased prices of energy, but not catastrophic. They can bounce back from it. But this is a very serious situation. It is still winter. It is starting to get a bit colder. February has been colder than January. And missing out on this energy has been a problem, especially because Transnistria has a lot of old people. People don't stay in Transnistria. Therefore, a lot of the people who are left are quite elderly and therefore vulnerable. And as much as the existence of Transnistria is a problem, for Moldova, for Ukraine, for everyone, I don't want to see old people suffer. So that situation does need to sort itself out. And the best solution, I should say, is to just accept help from Europe, especially when that's not even the only source of Russian energy. There's also the Turk Stream pipeline. Russia also sends gas south across the Black Sea through Turkey into southern Europe. So the solutions are there. The Transnistrian government is just being extraordinarily stubborn because they just expect Russia to solve this problem for them, which is just such a criminal and abuse of power. But as I said, it is a mafia pretending to be a state. And this crisis, I believe, will accelerate a future reintegration of Transnistria with the rest of Moldova because Transnistria could not survive as an island like this. But as to our other international topics apart from this pipeline issue, we're going to look at Georgia, Serbia, and Syria. In Georgia, an update on the protests there. Of course, the government is continuing to be ever more violent, lots of crackdowns. The protesters are staying in the streets. We've been talking about this most episodes since the situation has occurred. But the big update from that is that the Georgian government just kicked out the opposition political parties from the parliament. The entirety the parliamentary opposition had not been sitting in parliament out of protest because they said that the current parliament is illegitimate because of all the election fraud and ballot stuffing, etc. And so they did not recognize legitimacy of that government. So they did not show up to work. And the government used that excuse to say that they were being derelict of duty and strip them of their constituencies. This is a naked power grab. This means that Georgia Dream, the ruling party in Georgia, just decided that it didn't want an opposition anymore and got rid of them. And 3 members of the Georgia Dream party decided to form a, quote, healthy opposition. Just absolute ludicrous power grab done by the Georgian government that any electoral solution to this problem in Georgia right now looks increasingly impossible. The autocratic nature of Ivanishvili in the Georgia Dream regime has only become more emboldened, more violent, more extreme, and this may be their most extreme action yet. Georgian protesters, you no longer have any semblance of political representation, and you're not going to get it. The government is not going to allow there to be new elections unless it's forced upon them. But speaking of other protests, we go to Serbia. On November 1st, 2024, at the railway station in the city of Novi Sad, the canopy of the building, the concrete canopy, collapsed, falling onto the people below, busy killing 15 people. And it turned out that the reason it did this is because of corruption in the recent renovations of that railway station. It was done substandard. This canopy was not fixed, and so it fell apart and people are dead, leading to the phrase of the current Serbian protests, corruption kills. It does. Corruption, stealing from these projects, it doesn't have, it's not just people lining their pockets and the money won't be missed. That money used by the government is used in very important ways. I'm not talking about Donald Trump right now. And one of those ways is making sure that this train station was safe. But because Serbian officials stole, it wasn't. People are dead. These protests have been ongoing ever since then, because it's not just a matter of this one incident. There have been a variety of protests in Serbia for the last few years about this issue of corruption, and it has become a magnet for every other issue that can exist in the Serbian system. This has been in large part a student-led protest, and so a lot of student issues have been added to it, such as an increase in the education budget. Though much like in Georgia, the Serbian government has been extraordinarily disrespectful of these protesters and is trying to make them just go away. They think they can just ride this out and not have to give up any of their theft, and everything can go back to normal of them just making money. But like the Georgian protests, I don't think these Serbian protests are ending anytime soon. And we throw a lot of shade on Serbia at Ukraine Without Hype. The 90s did not make them look very good. And Serbia has been a supplier of volunteers for the Russian military in one of the largest numbers, including during the Donbass phase of the war, when there were Serbian volunteer units as part of the coalition of criminals. The Serbian government has been supportive of Russia in many ways, though on the back end has been selling weapons to Ukraine. So never miss an opportunity. That said, however, the Serbs definitely do have their tradition of protests. It was the Serbian Otpor, which became the model for what's now known as the Color Revolutions, when they overthrew the government of Slobodan Milosevic. And this really makes me want to do something about color revolutions in general. But now, much like Slovakia, Serbia is saying that or just like Georgia as well for that matter, both Slovakia and Georgia are blaming their protest movements on the perfidious Ukrainians. But in Serbia, they're doing the same thing, where they are saying that, these foreign interlopers are trying to rile up students who don't really know what they're doing. Just blame everything on outside forces rather than their own crimes. So this time, as you can expect, a lot of people have these complaints with the Serbian government, and there is a very broad base of support. Pretty much every Serb celebrity, it seems, has come out in favor of the protests. So good luck to y'all as well. This is a good cause to fight for. And the last international topic I'll be talking about is Syria. I don't feel as though this is the greatest place to get your Syria news. Go to people who discuss it further. But that said, we did discuss before how Ukraine intelligence had provided special forces to at least man drones in that final push to dislodge the Assad government. And as a part of that, Ukraine became the very first country to open up an embassy in free Syria. And the connections between the new Syrian government and Ukraine have been extremely friendly. That said, we had also discussed that the future of the Russian military bases in Latakia and Tartus were very much under review, and I made my prediction that they're probably going to stay there, and that does seem to be the case. It seems as though Russia will maintain its its bases in Latakia and Tartus, unless something big happens, but I already explained why I thought this would happen. Presence of Russia is a regional balancing act, even though Russia was murdering them for so long. Politics plays out the way that politics does. But turning back to I'm going to lump this in as a cultural topic because not much really changed outside of education, but Ukraine made the choice to recognize the Circassian Genocide. This is something that you may not have heard of before. It does not get much recognition or coverage or education in the West. But to describe the Circassian Genocide, you have to describe who the Circassians were. And, well, are, I should say. The Circassians were a people who lived on the northern side of the Caucasus Mountains. During this whole episode, Russian sources usually just refer to them as the Mountaineers. And through most of history, they had more of a tribal political formation, much like most of the rest of the North Caucasus, while the South Caucasus tended to be more organized as formal kingdoms. And the Circassian flag is made up of a bundle of arrows, each arrow representing a different tribe, which constitutes them. If you go back and listen to the history episode, which I recommend you all do, it's 2 episodes ago, I described how after Russia had solidified its control over Ukraine, it was able to expend more resources going southwards towards the Caucasus to butt up more against the Persian and Turkish empires. And the Circassians were the people who controlled about half, really, of that northern side. They were initially a largely Orthodox Christian people with a lot of continuing pre-Christian beliefs and practices. However, as Russia encroached more and more on their territory, they became closer and closer with the Ottoman Empire and adopted Islam. The conflict between Russia and the Circassians lasted a very, very long time, but it became much more extreme in the 1800s. Their violence became much more severe, and because genocides it's not a switch. They just don't start from nothing. Before the official genocide really took place, there was a Russian general named Grigory Zas. That's a very evil name, if you ask me, who was put in command of pacifying the Northern Caucasus. And he just was actively hunting down Circassians like they were animals. He was making a habit even of collecting their heads so they could be used in scientific research. General Zaz was a Baltic German. Latvia, Estonia had a German nobility before being conquered by Russia. They're a descendant of the Crusaders in the area. So Germans were the ruling class. And in my opinion, some of the most evil communities that ever existed. There's a lot of real evil dudes that came out of the Baltic Germans, but he is an example of them. Though he was eventually replaced, things only became more violent. So throughout the 1830s, various military commanders took it upon themselves to do genocidal activities on their own, with one General Yermolov saying that we need the Circassian lands, but we don't have any need of the Circassians themselves. So this violence continued for a long time, to the point where the Circassians, in order to appeal to outside powers to try and prevent this horrible violence being done against them, they decide they need to organize into a formal, modern style European state. They appealed to the Brits to try and get the Russians to stop, but none of these appeals worked whatsoever. And more Russian politicians and commanders began to advocate for the mass expulsion of the Circassian people. It was in 1863 when the official extermination order came down. This would no longer be done piecemeal, but in entirety. The Russian army marched across the Circassian countryside, killing everyone they saw, burning villages to the ground, placing bodies on spikes. Just the worst of the worst. This was complete, full-on exterminationist, genocidal, bloody violence. Rape was widespread, and Russian soldiers had specific permission to carry out as much rape as they felt like. They would destroy an area, and as refugees were fleeing into the woods, they would do an artillery bombardment of the woods in hopes of killing anyone who may have escaped. One quote by Circassian witness of this, Shaket, was saying that men and women were slaughtered mercilessly and blood flowed in rivers. So it was said that the bodies of the dead swam in a sea of blood. Nevertheless, the Russians were not content with what they had done, but sought to satisfy their instincts by making children targets for their cannon shells. The goal was to push the Circassians further and further towards the coast, herding them towards Sochi. Sochi you may recognize as the place where the Russians held the Winter Olympics, despite it being the one place in Russia that did not receive very much snow. But this was the capital, essentially, of the Circassian people. It is where they attempted to form a government. It's the city that, by the end of this, was almost completely exterminated of people so that the Russians could colonize in their place. I could talk a lot about a lot of specific crimes that happened here, but essentially the Russians wanted to push the Circassians towards the coast, and from the coast, they would try to flee towards the Ottoman Empire in these rickety boats, and many of them did not survive the albeit short boat ride from Sochi area down to the northern coast of what's now Turkey. A lot of these boats, because of the disease and such, arrived with everyone on board already dead. This was, in many ways, one of the first modern examples of genocide. There had been genocides before, of course, but the tactics used, the justifications used, the integration of scientific racism, of race science, that race science was still not very old at this point, to explain why this extermination would have happened. It places it as one of the earlier Holocaust-style genocides that happened in Europe. Though, you may notice that this took place in the 1860s during the American Civil War and also the Indian Wars, and yes, the Russians did justify their actions by appealing to how the Americans were doing a similar thing with the Native Americans, to the point where Victor Kochubey, a Russian prince who was actually of Crimean Cossack ancestry, but at this point had been completely Russified, said that, quote, "These Circassians are just like your American Indians, as untamable and uncivilized, and owing to their natural energy of character, extermination only would keep them quiet." So there's a bit of a dark parallel between the Russian and American experiences, and not the only one. This idea of a frontier, which they both romanticized and turned into a bit of a killing field, is a shared experience between the Russians and the Americans, though the wars against Native Americans were never this outwardly exterminationist in character. Not to downplay any of the violence, but it wasn't quite like this. I can say that. On May 21st, 1864, Russia declared its military victory in Sochi with a parade and a lot of corpses. So May 21st is now remembered as the Remembrance Day of the Circassian Genocide. Though in the decade that followed, Russians continued their extermination campaign, though at this point, any military resistance was largely broken. The Circassians had fled to a lot of other Ottoman territories. There's a lot of Circassians in the Levant. Many of them went to Bulgaria, though the Circassians had long been pretty common in the Levant. Not all Circassians in Jordan, for example, are survivors of the Circassian Genocide. There had been a long history of migration, long history of slavery of Circassians. Though, interestingly, just another note, the Circassians often made up a form of a soldier aristocracy in a lot of places due to the use of Circassian slave soldiers. The Mamluk dynasty in Egypt, for example, many of them were Circassian or Turks from north of the Caucasus Mountains. So a pretty remarkable people historically whose impact on the world is much larger than people know of. But Ukraine, just this year, became only the second country to recognize these events as a genocide. And that's always a very important thing as far as genocide recognition, as a part of healing, as a part of education, as a part of, in this case, political reconciliation. Because one of the things that makes the Ukrainian recognition of the Circassian Genocide so important is that Ukrainian people took part in it. I mentioned that Russian prince being from a Cossack family. A lot of the soldiers that took part in this would have been Ukrainian Cossacks. I mentioned in the history episode that after the destruction of the Zaporizhian Siege, a lot of Cossacks were then used to form regiments in the Kuban and the North Caucasus. This is what they were doing in the Kuban and the North Caucasus. They were taking part in the Russian imperial expansion southwards and doing the killing. The modern state of Ukraine is, of course, not responsible for this. These were ethnic Ukrainian soldiers in the service of Russia, but they were still Ukrainian. And especially now that the Ukrainian government has also made the decree that last year they had made the decree that they were going to do education and outreach on the idea that these Ukrainians living outside the borders of Ukraine, especially Russia, in the Kuban region, in the Russian Far East, in these different places that Russia used Ukrainians as colonists, that's also a part of Ukrainian history and a part of Ukrainian culture. And recognizing those things also means recognizing the bad of that. And so this is a very mature and important thing for Ukraine to do. That said, from a political angle, it is also part of Ukraine's strategy to connect itself to the various ethnic struggles, various national struggles that are happening within the borders of the Russian Federation. There is a Circassian national movement in Russia, though it is, as you would expect, extremely heavily repressed. They're often arrested, have their free speech suppressed, have their organizations broken up. But there are still some Circassians living in their homelands, even though 90+% of them at the time were either killed or expelled. And so these movements are there, and Ukraine is trying to reach out to them, as it does reach out to Chechens, Dagestanis, Yakuts, everyone else within Russia who may want some level of freedom from the Putin and his dictatorship. And in fact, over the course of the previous year, there had been increasing outreach by Circassian activists to the Ukrainian government, though obviously not ones who still lived in Russia. A lot of them wisely fled the country because of persecution for their political beliefs. And these activists had been lobbying the Ukrainian government. If you look at, for example, the Holodomor Museum, they had been holding events recognizing the Circassian genocide. It's been coming, but glad to see it. And I hope more can be done, although Ukraine doesn't exactly have all the resources in the world to do education programs for this on top of everything else. And just to finish this off, Ukraine, second country to do this. The first country to do this was Georgia, after they had opened up some old Russian imperial archives that had existed in Tbilisi that gave a lot of the details of how this genocide went down. After they discovered those, they recognized the Circassian Genocide. But yeah, number one, now number two. But to finish this episode off, after we just talked about a genocide, maybe I should have put that sooner in the episode to give it a bit more of a soft landing here. But other elements of Ukrainian culture that took place. One, Oleksandr Usyk beat Tyson Fury in the rematch on December 21st. That's a long time ago by now, but we've not had a news episode since then. Honestly, not the most exciting fight in the world to watch. But with Usyk cementing his victory over Tyson Fury after previously taking his championship belts from him, there's really nobody left in the heavyweight division for Usyk to fight. He beat everyone. He won. He won boxing. I think that means he won at boxing. He won the sport. Congratulations, Oleksandr Usyk. You won boxing. But the other event that just happened is the selection for Eurovision. And Romeo would not like to be here for talking about Eurovision because he could not care less, but I like Eurovision, so I'll give some opinions on it. So I'll just talk about the top 3 choices. So basically what happens is that for Eurovision, the Eurovision Song Contest, every country sends one representative act, and people vote to see which act wins. Whoever wins will host the next Eurovision. It is the Olympics for extremely homosexual European pop music, and it's wonderful. And Ukraine just had its selection process for who would represent Ukraine in Eurovision Song Contest, and historically this is a pretty big deal. Ukraine's a very strong Eurovision country, has never been disqualified, and often does extremely well, often landing in the top 10. So a lot of expectations are on whoever was selected. But I'll go over the top 3. So at number 3 in the selection was Masha Kondratenko with her song No Time to Cry. And Masha was an interesting pick here because although she is an extremely talented singer in my opinion and a lot of other people's opinions, she's good. She's very, very good. She's also largely been pretty silly. She rose to a lot of fame, at least to me. The first thing I saw her as, she may have been more famous before that, was a song basically making fun of Russian soldiers being killed. It's very poppy, very silly, and it's something that a lot of people needed to hear, this glorious, victorious song about sending the Russian soldiers away in body bags. So she always had this kind of pretty silly character to her, kind of scandalous in a way sometimes too. But this song that she selected, No Time to Cry, was a pretty mature sound for her. So I was kind of rooting for her because of that, because it's good to see people creatively evolve. And she also really put out her skills as a professionally trained dancer as well. However, that did come in third because everyone was good. Everyone was good. The second one, I think, was the one that I wanted to win. Melody, with their song My Sea, was about the Sea of Azov, about going home to the Sea of Azov and how they miss their home as they're from Mariupol. Mariupol, this city on the sea, they obviously can't go back to it. And in fact, one of the singers, he doesn't know what happened to his dad. His father was most likely killed by Russia in the siege of Mariupol. So the song, which is in both Ukrainian and English, starts with the lines, "Do you remember the last time you slept at home? You feel alone, your pillow's made of stone. Do you remember the warmth of your loved one's hands? Time has passed and there's no path." I think a lot of people in Ukraine can relate to these feelings of losing your home, losing your sea, being tossed about by foreign winds. I think it's, as far as a Eurovision song, which are usually pretty poppy and silly, pretty powerful stuff. Though Jamala won with a song about the Crimean Genocide, so not unusual territory for Ukrainian Eurovision contestants. Here's a song about Russia murdering everyone I love. Though the first place song was a bit lighter. The band Zifferblatt with the song Bird of Prey, kind of an alt-rock, and really I think the most Eurovision song that they offered, maybe with some of the top 3, it was the most Eurovision-y. And it was the favorite going in, so them winning really was no real surprise. They're quite talented as well, so they will represent Ukraine in Basel, Switzerland on May 13th. So good luck to them. The entire country will be rooting for them. But that ends our big news update of everything that was not Trump. If you would like to support Ukraine Without Hype, tell your friends and family. You can go to our YouTube. You can go to our social medias. I just realized we are on Blue Sky now as well to avoid... Musk has made it so much more problematic to be on Twitter, but still mostly on Twitter. Romeo has migrated to Blue Sky, so you'll find him there. If you would like to support Ukraine, you can go to our link tree, see the resources listed there. I'm going to update. I promise I'll update that soon. If you would like to support Ukraine without hype financially, and things are getting tight in Ukraine in general. So whoever you want to throw some dollars to, everyone would appreciate it, including myself. But you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine without hype. You can also go to patreon.com/NVUA to support the new voice of Ukraine, referring back to my spiel at the whole beginning of the episode. That is also where we are doing work. So I'd like to thank all of our patrons. Thank you very much to Deborah Grazer, Randy McDerlin. The voices in my head are from Big Pharma, David Shepard, Giorgio, Vana Kukratskaya, Michael Drucker, Mike Anonymous, Barbara Streisand, Dennis Napalm, Devi, Dimitri Litvin, Elizabeth Hughes, James Burke, Jan, Yanara, Jenny Louise, Calvin Alberton, Kyle Smith, Marguerite, Megan, Michael Wickman, Nick, PLM, Silas Frank, T. Bart, Vivek, Abel, Ada McDonald, Alex Grochmal, Anastasia, Andrew Glenn, Can Dystopian Fiction Please Remain Fiction, Captain Technical, Chris Bennington, Christopher Yee, Dan, David Wall, Demetrio, Dish Taco, Emily Bivona, Etienne, Evelyn, Francois, Grace Krause. Just realized we had a string of French names there. Wonderful. Had to Laugh, Jacob Holm, James Wise, Jared Bradley, Jerd, Julia Lindsay, Justin R., Kiki, Kyle Johnson, Laura DeLeon, Laura Halila, Lemonikin, Levy Grove, Marianne, Matt Miller, Melissa Kaselko, Anonymous, Noah Brown, Noam Hart, RDK, Sanjay, Scott Burry, Scott Tokayuk, Stuart Akers, Subtle Knife, Ursula, Veronica, William Brown, Zay Perry, and Marcus. Thank you all very much for your support. You are what makes this all possible. And until next week, Slava Ukraini.